Hello, my name is Bob Palmer, coming to you from the History Center of Olmsted County, which celebrates its 100th anniversary this year. This is one of 12 conversations with local historians and members of the History Center staff. We will also take a look at events in and around Rochester the year the Historical Society formed.
To learn more about what's happening at the History Center, visit olmstedhistory.com.
Today we visit with Dr. Paul Scanlon and Dr. Virginia Wright-Peterson, two noted and celebrated Olmsted County authors, about their journey into our community's past. Then the Olmsted County newsreader will take a look at some of the stories making news in Rochester 100 years ago this month. First, could each of you tell me a little bit about yourselves? And why don't we start with you, Jenny?
Sure. Well, I'm originally from Rochester, born at St. Mary's Hospital, and my father worked at IBM from the time that plant opened here, and my mother was a medical secretary at Mayo until she started a family. My family's stories intersect with the local history in a lot of ways. My grandmother and my great-aunt were nurses at Colonial Hospital, and my grandparents were live-in gardeners for Dr. Henry and Daisy Plummer. I worked at Mayo in finance and administration for many years, including at Mayo Clinic, Arizona, when it first opened. Mid-career, I went back to school and got a degree in English and taught English and humanities in Rochester. I also taught at the University of Algeria in Algiers, and I did a rotation with the Red Cross in Iraq. I just retired a few weeks ago from an administrative role at University of Minnesota, Rochester, and I have one daughter, 2 grandchildren, a dog, and several chickens.
Oh, great. Paul, what about you?
Greetings. My name is Paul Scanlon. I'm a retired Mayo Clinic physician. I've been retired for 6 years now. I, too, am a native of Rochester, born here and also at St. Mary's Hospital. I frequently say, jokingly but truthfully, that my Mayo Clinic number starts with a 1. Grew up in Rochester. I've lived all but 9 years of my life in Rochester. I'm a graduate of Mayo High School, class of 1971. And went to the University of Minnesota as an undergraduate, and then was for 4 years I was back here in Rochester at Mayo Medical School. I did my training in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins in internal medicine and Harvard at the Brigham and Women's Hospital in pulmonary and critical care medicine, and after which I returned to Rochester on the staff of the Mayo Clinic. And I served as a member of the Division of Pulmonary and Critical Care Medicine for 35 years, retiring in 2019. And at that point I wrote these books. The motivation of the books was, as a native of Rochester in an institution where almost nobody is from Rochester, questions come up all the time about local history, and I became sort of a resource person that people came to with questions. And when I retired, I figured, if I don't write these stories down, nobody else will. My grandfather was a great storyteller, and nobody ever wrote his stories down, so they died with him. So I thought it would be worthwhile to write them down, and that's how I got interested in writing the first book.
Yes. Jenny, you wrote Rochester, an urban biography, Woman's War II, and Women of Mayo. How did you become interested in history, and what drew you to these subjects?
Well, I also had a grandfather. Our backgrounds are so amazingly similar because I'm also a graduate of Mayo High School, and just as you were talking, Paul, it is amazing. And I had a grandfather who told stories, and he was interested in history, specifically the Civil War and the role that Minnesota played. I have memories as a child going on trips with him and my grandmother to find gravestones of Minnesota soldiers in cemeteries in the South. But as a kid, I wasn't that interested. Although he gave me a subscription to, I think it was American History magazine, and somehow I think it rubbed off on me. But the story part, the love of a really good story, That came from my mother, who took me to the public library and the bookmobile as a child, and I just really learned to love good stories. So kind of combining the stories with history made a lot of sense for me, and again, with a focus on the local area, since my family's been here now with my grandchildren for 7 generations, that seemed to make sense. And I think along the way I started to recognize that a lot of what was out there had gaps in it. The histories and the stories weren't entirely complete. So I at one point felt inspired to help complete them.
Paul, your Rochester Memories has a wide selection of stories of the city's exciting past. I found particularly amusing your account of nude swimmers at Rochester High School. Could you tell us about that?
That always draws attention. It's been in the paper a number of times, and questions come up all the time. And I actually experienced that when I was in junior high school and high school. They still had the practice of the boys swimming nude for Phi Ed, and I think for the swimming team as well. And it was in fact the truth. They did, boys did swim nude, and I guess in retrospect it wasn't quite so disconcerting at the time, because it was sort of like skinny dipping in the pond. But the funniest response I've come across was when a round of incredulity came up when people were asking questions about this. Someone asked Dick Thatcher, who was the AAU coach for many years and the coach both at John Marshall and at Mayo High School for the boys swimming teams, coached many state and national champions. And Dick Thatcher was a sort of legendary coach in this community. Somebody asked him once, why did they do that? And his answer was, why not?
Okay. Jenny, in the introduction to your urban biography, you say that you seek a more inclusive history. Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. It's really been a journey of discovery for me. My interest in actually starting to write the local history was spurred when I was working at Mayo Clinic. And we kept hearing more about the accomplishments of the Mayo doctors than the women. And one year for Women's History Month, some colleagues and I decided to do an activity, create an activity, a Jeopardy game. And I volunteered to go to the Mayo archive and try and get some information on women we didn't know about. But I figured there were just, the 5 or so women, Edith, Graham, Mayo, and Mother Alfred, that I would just be getting more facts about them. But when I arrived in that archive, they brought me boxes and folders and all kinds of information about women I'd never heard of, which seemed surprising to me since I was from Rochester. How could there be all of this history that I didn't know anything about? So we did do our Jeopardy game, and interestingly, Dr. Scanlon won. So he knows women's history as well as the rest of it. But after that, it just kind of started bugging me. Why don't we know about these women? And I did a little research. I checked the most comprehensive history of the local area that I could find at the time, and it was a pictorial history. And I quickly went through it and I counted all of the photos in the book, and it had 240 some photos. Only 18% of them were photos of women, and there were actually more photos of horses than there were of women. And that was the tipping point. That's when I'm like, okay, if no one else is going to write this down, I'm going to get involved. And so it just has expanded. My primary focus has been adding women's history into the canon, if you will, but then also helping to do more with stories of people of color, Native Americans, LGBTQ+. I mean, there's just so much history out there that we really haven't documented yet.
Okay, kind of following along on that, I was struck by your account of the Rochester Women's Club. and its role in the community development. Could you tell us more about that?
Sure. Well, the men were focused primarily on the business, the commerce, setting up the government in the early years of forming Rochester in the Olmsted County area. And women were focused on the well-being of families in the community. And in 1894, the Women's Club started formed sort of formally, and started doing things like creating the first public restroom, we think, in the state of Minnesota. So people would come in from outside of town to do business, to do shopping, etc., and there wasn't a public restroom or even a place for women to wait while men they might be with were doing business. So that's kind of fun. But they created cooking lessons, a kindergarten. They basically were the first public health department, getting involved in health inspections of meat and visiting nurses for schools, garbage removal, things that we now think of as pretty basic. These women advocated for.
Yes. That first public restroom, was there? I've come across the one that was formed in 1926 from that estate. Now, was that up on 6th Street or 6th Avenue?
I am not sure of the exact location of the one that might have come about in the late 1800s.
Okay.
Probably would have been on the statuary lot.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay. Paul, in Rochester Stories, you tell of the arrival of Dr. W.W. Mayo. Could you share with us some of what you learned?
Yeah, W.W. Mayo is a fascinating character. Just to tell you a little bit about how interesting this guy is. In the book, The Doctor's Mayo, which is Helen Clapesaddle's definitive history of the Mayo Clinic up to 1940, the unabridged version is an 800-plus page book, of which the first 250 pages are about W.W. Mayo, whom nowadays most people don't know much, if anything, about. The abridged version, which is what you can buy in the bookstores nowadays, it's not the original hardcover, it's only 500-some pages, and the 250 pages about W.W. Mayo were abridged to 80 pages, so there's a lot left out from what people have access to. This is a fascinating character, a very impatient man who was born same year as Queen Victoria near Manchester, England, who had an interesting educational background, supposedly trained with Dalton, the chemist, in chemistry, and was also trained as a tailor. As an impatient young man, he emigrated to the United States, spent a brief time in New York working in a hospital pharmacy, but hated New York and quickly, after a year or so, moved westward, ended up in LaPorte, Indiana, where he lived for a number of years and got his first and second medical degree, first in Indiana, second in Missouri. But in 1854, while married to his wife Louise, he was suffering from the consequences of what was probably recurrent malaria. And during one of his feverish episodes, he lost patience with the climate and told his wife that I'm going west until I either die or find a place to settle, and eventually ended up in Minnesota in St. Paul. His wife came to live with him then. She was actually the main means of support of the family. She had a hat business. She was a milliner, and she supported him, and he, in his impatience, spent several trips hiking up to the Duluth area 3 times. During one of his trips, got lost in the woods, was rescued by Indians, by the indigenous people. He then, after a while living in St. Paul, could never establish his medical practice. There was too much competition. So he was a very impulsive man, and his wife got tired of following him around, but he'd moved to Le Sueur, Minnesota to farm and to try to establish his medical practice again, but again without a great deal of success. And it was then that they went through the experience of the Dakota War, which occurred in 1862. And then in 1863, he was appointed by Abraham Lincoln to be the examining physician for the conscription board for southern Minnesota, headquartered in Rochester. So he came to Rochester in 1863, and Louise followed in 1864 with the kids, and they got through the Civil War. Then he was the examining physician for the Union Army. He was very productive in that. He examined people at an amazing speed. Interestingly, he got fired from his position because he was accused of taking fees. He did extra examinations because there was a long line of people waiting to get through their examinations, and for a modest fee he would see people in the evening in overtime hours, and turned out that was a breach of the Army rules, and so he was initially accused of all kinds of malfeasance for this fee. Turned out that on careful examination, his examinations were very accurate, and there was no ill intention or misdeeds of any sort. So he was not charged with anything, but he was fired. And so then he intended to leave, but his wife put her foot down and said, "I'm not moving again." So she insisted on staying in Rochester, unlike my wife, who couldn't wait to leave. But they then stayed. But he actually did at one point quit his practice. About a year and a half later, in the late 1860s, he quit his Rochester practice, and we went into practice again in St. Paul, which he did for a year or so, until on one weekend coming home to Rochester, his train was held up in Casson because of a snowstorm blizzard. Mm-hmm. So he waited a day to get going, and the trains weren't moving. So he hiked through this huge snowfall, hiked 18 miles from Casson back to Rochester. And at that point, he decided it wasn't worth the commute, so he moved his practice back to Rochester. So he was a fascinating character, and there's way more interesting stories about him.
Okay. Jenny, you write about Sister Joseph in Women of Mayo. She was a contemporary of Dr. W.W. Could you fill us in on her significance?
Sure. So a lot of us think of Mother Alfred, who was the visionary and founder of St. Mary's Hospital, and her story is fascinating too, how she got to Rochester and all of the barriers and things that she endured in getting St. Mary's set up and open after the cyclone tornado of 1883. But after it opened in 1889, part of her visionary sense was to choose a successor. And so she looked, the Sisters of St. Francis had a number of schools throughout the region. And she chose a sister that she thought could be an administrator of the hospital to succeed her upon her retirement. And she chose Sister Joseph Dempsey, who was originally from the Rochester area, just outside of town in the Haverhill Township, along what they called the Irish Ridge, a Catholic family that supplied the Sisters of St. Francis with at least 3 sisters, including Sister Joseph. So she became the administrator when Sister Mother Alfred stepped down, and I never had any idea. They named the buildings of the campus after the sister leaders, and so there's a building out there, the Alfred building, the Joseph building, the Domitilla building, etc. And even when I worked and had an office out at St. Mary's, I'd walk through the Joseph building having no idea who she was as the second person in charge. And when I did the research for this book, I found out that she ended up being the administrator for St. Mary's for nearly 40 years. And she took it from its opening at 27 beds to over 600 beds, making it really the largest and finest privately owned hospital in the United States. She was just an incredible administrator, and I'll come back to that in just a second, but she was also a clinician in that she was Dr. Will's surgical assistant for 15 of those 40 years. So Dr. Will obviously could have anyone he wanted to be his assistant in surgery, and yet she was chosen and continued in that role for that duration. He trusted her so much, so there'd be these theater surgical suites, and people would come from all over the world to watch Dr. Will do surgery, and he'd be doing it, and then occasionally he'd pause to explain what he was doing or what was going on. Sister Joseph would be continuing the procedure as he spoke. So there's a lot about how wonderful she was in the operating room, but she was also such a fine administrator that when they did one of their expansions, and there were many, she expanded the hospital in 1894, 1898, 1904, 1909, 1912, and this is adding operating rooms and maternity wards and beds and everything. But then in I think it was 22, they did a rather large expansion, and the retailers downtown closed, all the businesses closed for a couple of hours so people could come tour the facility, and a lot of people gave speeches. And I just want to note that Dr. Henry Plummer referred to her as a genius. Only someone of the great genius and one of great faith would dare to double the size of this already great hospital. The genius, faith, and vision of Sister Joseph put this big thing through. So that's Dr. Plummer referring to her. And Dr. Will also had an awful lot of really positive things to say. Again, not only about the importance of the building, which is brick and mortar, but that it's the ideals and spirit that builds the shelters, and the ideals and spirit within it that make the building great. And what he said, quote, what we accomplish in the future will not be due to the brick and mortar, but to the soul and spirit that reside in St. Mary's Hospital. So I think she's really under-recognized in the history of the medical center in Rochester.
Interesting. Question for both of you, and we'll start with Paul. What are your favorite stories or people from your books?
One of my favorites is, it's hard to select just one, but one of my favorites is Leland Fiegel, whom most people have never heard of, and is, in fact, is the answer to the question, why was the IBM plant built in Rochester? So it's a fairly long and complicated story, but I'll try to briefly summarize. Leland Fiegel was born in 1914 and was the son of Lester Fiegel, who was the vice president of one bank and so later on the president of another bank, very successful local businessman, prominent leader of the community. He was head of the draft board during World War I, and was on the school board and a bunch of other civic organizations. But Leland Fiegel grew up in Rochester, local kid, and graduated from high school in, I believe, 1932. During that time, as he was growing up, he was inspired by aviation. His father was one of the first investors in the Rochester, it was an aerospace group that was early funders of aviation in Rochester. And his father was one of the promoters of the first Rochester airport. he got interested in aviation, went to the University of Minnesota as an undergraduate, and when he graduated from college in 1936, he joined the Army Air Force, which was the predecessor of the modern Air Force. He got his wings in 1937 and flew for mainly with then Colonel, subsequently General Follett Bradley. He was worked closely with Bradley for much of his early career, and Bradley described Fiegel as one of the finest pilots he ever worked with. So he worked with Bradley early on, and eventually, when World War II came around, Bradley took on a bigger role, was promoted to Major General, a 3-star general, and was in charge of negotiating the terms of the Lend-Lease agreement with Stalin. And so Bradley was asked to fly a mission to Moscow to negotiate the terms with Stalin and Churchill. And Wendell Willkie joined this group in Moscow. He was the principal negotiator. The pilot that he selected to fly this, they flew a B-24 Liberator bomber on this mission. The pilot he selected was Leland Fiegel. And the co-pilot, who was Bradley's adjutant, his first assistant, was Thomas Watson Jr., the eventual CEO of IBM. So Watson and Fiegel became good friends on this long mission. It was a circuitous, round-the-world mission. They flew from Shreveport, Louisiana, to the Caribbean, to Brazil, across the pond to southern Africa, up several stages through Africa, then through the Middle East, and up over the Caucasus to Moscow. And on the return trip, they flew back by way of Siberia, and with a stop in China along the way. It was a 4-month mission, so they were together for a long time. And during this time, Fiegel was a great mentor to Watson and taught him a number of things about flying the difficult plane. Saved them one time for sure when they were flying over Siberia and the plane got iced up. And Fiegel was able to save the plane and get back to their base in Yakutsk, which was very difficult flying. And so Watson gained a great appreciation of Fiegel during this time. After the war, they both went on during the war. Fiegel was a great leader of 93rd Bomber Squadron, which was one of the most decorated bomber squadrons in the war, based first in Africa and then in the UK. And together they flew several hundred missions and were both one of the most effective and one of the fewest casualties in their division. After the war, Fiegel stayed in the Air Force and took part in the separation of the Air Force from the Army to establish it as an independent branch of the U.S. military. And he was in charge of education for the Air Force at the Pentagon in 1948. And to get some hours in for his license certification, he checked out a twin-engine Beechcraft one day, flew up to New York to visit his friend Tom Watson at the IBM headquarters. This is in 1948. And on his way back from that trip, he blew an engine and his plane exploded and he was killed, along with 2 crewmen. So it had a profound impact on Watson. In 1956, 8 years later, Watson had been promoted to CEO of IBM by that time, and IBM was needing to build a new plant, and Rochester was not under consideration at that time, and he suggested that they include Rochester in the deliberation of potential sites. And so the consulting group that they hired to evaluate the sites eventually came down with the choice of Madison, Wisconsin versus Rochester, Minnesota, and presented it to Watson for his decision of which to pick. And his question was, is it an equal recommendation to both? The answer is yes, it's an equal recommendation. He said, then we'll pick Rochester as a tribute to Leland Fiegel.
Oh.
And he announced it later in Rochester as a tribute to Leland Fiegel. So that's the reason we have the IBM plant here.
Great story.
Yeah.
Great story. Thank you. Jenny, who's one of your favorite stories or people in your book?
Yeah, I always like and there are a number of them, the women that are just sort of surprising, like just different than everybody else. And one that comes to mind is Dr. Georgina Luden, who came to the clinic in 1914, and she was Dutch. She was educated in Munich by some really well-known physicians and scientists. And but as World War I was intensifying in that, she decided she wanted to be overseas. So she came first to Texas, and after being there for a little while, the physician there in Galveston sent a letter to Dr. Will introducing her, and this is how he introduced Dr. Georgine Luden. He said, she's a woman of remarkable attainments, a very charming woman, very cosmopolitan, and of great intellectual force. She's a very wealthy woman in her own right and has apparently taken up the study of medicine as a hobby. I feel certain you will find her extremely interesting and thoroughly emancipated, which I thought was a great description. So Dr. Will knew kind of what he was getting, I think, in terms of someone with an intelligent woman with a potentially forceful personality. When she arrived on the train in Rochester, she came with her own staff, a cook, a maid, and a chauffeur/gardener, and her dogs. And she rented several rooms of one of the most popular hotels until she could build a house. So she was also just very interested in the arts. She painted herself, and that I think was a little bit unusual at the time. She was part of her arts interest. There was a singer that she met on a voyage coming over, and this woman ended up being ill and was cared for at Mayo. And then there's a bit of a love story between that woman and an architect in town who ended up being one of the best known architects, Harold Crawford, here in town. So the architecture, the painting, the singing, she would open her home to have sort of salons on the weekends and invite people interested in art there. So again, this seemed kind of unique and a little in contrast to the otherwise very, very scientific nature. She did, though, her share of science. She was researching cancer and had interest that possibly the kind of smog, air pollution from coal could be contributing to high incidence of different diseases, in particular cancers. But there is kind of an interesting photo of her, a portrait of her taken where she's holding a cigarette in her hand. So she hadn't quite found the answer.
Great. Okay, Paul, we'll start with you again since we have this kind of rotation. Next, if you could live in another era in Olmsted County history, what would it be and why?
Well, I think if I'm to be reincarnated, I think it would be a different species, first of all. I'd come back as a peregrine falcon, the apex predator.
Yeah.
But choosing a time in history, I have a hard time. I think I'm not one of these people who thinks romantically of the past as the good old days, because I think that we probably live in the best time currently, by my judgment. But if I were to think about when would be the most interesting time to live, I'm thinking that time before the white settlers came. The white settlers came to Rochester in 1854, and before that, the Dakota were the people who lived here. And the best time, I think, in their history was the early 18th century. The horse was introduced beginning in the 17th century from New Mexico and reached the Midwest, reached the Dakota people around 1705. And the French traders came as early as 1680. So the time at the beginning of the 18th century, the early 1700s, they had the horse, they had steel tools, or iron and steel tools, and the depopulation of the area had already occurred, so they were not heavily overpopulated. Agriculture was relatively easy with the new tools. There was plenty of game, plenty of fur to be traded, and so life was actually quite good. There was plenty of recreational time. Lacrosse was their principal sport, and it was played most notably at the fields of Prairie du Chien, which is not too far away. So there was probably the best time in the lives of the Dakota people were in the early 18th century. The one caveat I would have, or the one request I would have if I were to move to that point, it would be to have immunization against infectious diseases, which they lacked and which resulted in a number of epidemics. So life was pretty good for them, but for the infectious diseases. So if I could be reincarnated to any time in history, I think that would be it.
Yeah. I think within the term virgin land or whatever, that the Native Americans were, they had no natural immunity to any of the diseases that the European settlers brought with them.
Right. The term virgin terrain, virgin forests, virgin prairies is actually a misnomer, because the indigenous people cultivated both the forests and the fields, the prairies, very extensively with fire.
Yep.
So what you saw as what appeared to be a virgin prairie and a virgin forest was actually heavily cultivated over a period of several centuries.
Interesting. Jenny?
Yeah, that is an interesting choice of time. I wouldn't have thought of it, but I see your point. I think, though, I would choose the 1920s in Rochester. I would love to have been able to walk into the first Mayo Clinic building that opened in 1914 and see the potted palm trees and the wicker furniture and the flow of patients coming from all over the world to this little. I mean, it wasn't that little, but littleish town in the prairie. Maud Mellish Wilson, the editor, and just a remarkable woman, librarian, head of the library, would be fun to engage with. Dr. Luden would be around at that time. And then the Plummer building itself, which was just called the Clinic building, not the Plummer building at that time, right, as they needed more space than they had in that first building. Seeing that magnificent building go up, all of that coming to be during that time, I think would be wonderful. But I also agree with Dr. Scanlon, there's no golden time, and that also would have been the time. And I think as difficult as it would be, I'm so curious about it, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in Rochester, and seeing them in the parade on Flag Day, and just that complexity, and how did that all work in Rochester would be interesting to me as well.
Absolutely.
You get to vote too.
Sorry?
You get to vote too.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right. No sense coming back before I can vote.
Okay. How have each of you used the History Center in your research efforts? Paul, did you start us off?
Yeah, very extensively. I think it's the sine qua non of doing historical research in Rochester. Fortunately, I had the access to the Mayo archives as well as the History Center archives. So I've worked from both my own personal collection of books and resources from Rochester, the Mayo archives and the History Center archives, and the resources are great. We're sitting here with Krista Lewis, who's the archivist, And Krista's a great resource person, and any questions you have about any particular source or reference or individual or historical event, she's got tons of archival material that are available for study.
Yes. Okay. Jenny?
Yeah, I agree. Nothing I've written would have been possible without the History Center, the archives, and the people like Krista. And the volunteers, there are some amazingly knowledgeable volunteers here. And I agree with Dr. Scanlon, the ability to be able to collaborate with the public library holds some things, and the Mayo Archive holds some things, and the collaboration that can exist among them has been really powerful, including the most recent, if I can say, access to the digitized Rochester papers, now going back to 1858. This has just been released that on newspapers.com we can digitally search those newspapers because of work that the History Center and the Rochester Public Library did with the Post Bulletin to make this possible. I'm so excited. I want to go back and re-look at a number of the topics that I have written about in the past, and I suspect I will be able to find more information than I had before, so greatly appreciative.
Okay. One last question. Why do you think history or learning about the past is important? You want to start first?
Well,
you bat lead off?
Yeah, sure. It's the level of interest in history in general, particularly local history, is just overwhelming. And the response that I've received from my books and just prior to that, just knowing some of the history, being a local native, it's tremendous. People's interest is tremendous, and the understanding and interest in culture in general and history in particular is very compelling. It brings us together. It brings our love of our community to the fore, and I think it's just been a tremendous experience for me working with the local history.
Jenny?
Yeah, I think it is kind of multifaceted, and I certainly agree with having a better sense of our community and identity, and again making it as inclusive as possible so we know that all of the stories are being shared and celebrated. I also think it can inspire us to make better decisions in the future, especially as we think about a past that includes racism and sexism, and it is an opportunity for us to reflect on those things and then maybe make some different choices, advocate for being even a better community going forward.
Okay. Thank you, Jenny, Paul, for a great discussion.
If you'd like to help the History Center and its mission, please consider making a contribution by going to olmstedhistory.com/donate.
Now let's look at what was making news in Olmsted County in 1926 with the Olmsted County News Reader. Expansion of tunnels linking Mayo properties and the buildings of the Kaler Corporation will soon grow to nearly 3 blocks in length along underground passages for heat, water, and light of even greater length. The traffic tunnel will be constructed from the one now running north from Mayo Clinic southward under the boulevard to the east side of 2nd Avenue to the north line of 3rd Street southwest, and then west to Worrell Hospital. Tunnels already connecting the clinic, the Kaler, Damon, Colonial, Curry hospitals, and Zumbro Hotel. Contracts for the completion of city improvements, including widening, paving, and repaving, sewer construction, and street grading, at an estimated cost of more than $22,000, will be let by the Common Council in July. The street widening program includes widening 3rd Street from Broadway to the Rochester Mill to 50 feet. 2nd and 4th Streets are also set for work. The Olmsted County Grand Jury has recommended that the county and city prisoners serve their sentences at hard labor. The report reads, the grand jury recommends that municipal and district judges sentence all prisoners to serve at hard labor. The grand jury suggests the prisoners should work on public maintenance or improvements which are available. Judge Finkelberg made no comment on their recommendations. Work is expected to begin in August on a new $1.5 million Mayo Clinic building. The new structure will be 13 stories high. Excavations will start once improvements on the central school are completed for the clinic use as temporary quarters. The orthopedic section will move to the school to allow its present location in the Mayo Library to be destroyed to make the room for the new building. The new structure, which is to be 2 stories higher than the Kaler, will be of Moorish design, built of limestone and brick. A 27-year-old Stewartville farmer, Homer Flathers, has been struck by lightning. Mr. Flathers lives but cannot recall what happened and was deaf for hours. All he remembers is that he was walking through the pasture about 30 feet from a large tree. More than an hour later, he stumbled into the house covered in mud. Thinking that the cry or his 3-week-old baby was a phonograph, he yelled, "Shut it off!" at his wife. The lightning bolt struck his head, and the back half of his cap was burned to shreds and crumpled like charred paper. His hair is seared, and the outside of his left arm badly burned from the neck to the wrist. A hole the size of a $50 is burned to the bone of the foot where the charge entered the ground. In the pasture, there is a spot about 6 feet in diameter where he apparently wallowed in the mud following the stroke. E.W. Nitz of Rochester has applied to the United States Patent Office for an improvement on rear warning signals for automobiles. Mr. Nitz told the public at a demonstration yesterday that my claim covers warnings for right and left turns. The control for the warning signs is carried on the steering wheel. When the driver wishes to notify anyone in his rear that he plans to turn right, he presses one of the buttons and a large red sign appears reading, "Right turn." Mr. Nitz also has a large stop sign to turn on when he's coming to a halt. Now playing at the Lawler is Old Loves and New, starring Louis Stone, Tully Marshall, and Barbara Bedford. Sale of poppies by members of the American Legion Auxiliary Saturday resulted in the collection of more than $600, breaking all records. More than 30 women sold 5,000 flowers purchased for distribution this year. The funds will be used as welfare relief for sick and disabled ex-servicemen and their families. Publication of lurid details of the Canyon case in the Rochester Post-Bulletin has drawn the ire of local Women's Civil League at their regular meeting at the Public Health Center. League President Mrs. T.P. Hall said that the newspaper should have omitted details from the newspaper story and printed them in a handbill instead. People wanting such information could come to the newspaper office and request them. Mrs. E.S. Judd declared such news ought not to be featured in headlines on the front page of a newspaper. Discussion centered on the case of a 22-year-old girl who may be charged for murder for burying an infant child near the Terrace Heights district. Mrs. Hall asserted, "I think it is terrible the ignominy that young girl is being made to endure, and I think we women should do something about it. There is a man partly to blame, and he should be made to suffer half of it." Claire Siegel won first place in the point swimming contest this past semester, scoring 5,492 points, defeating the nearest competitor by 100 points. Passing motorists helped rescue Mrs. J.F. Struth from her overturned burning car Saturday afternoon. The vacation trip of the Struth family was cut short when their car left the road and overturned in a shallow ditch on a detour west of Owatonna. Also in the car was Mr. Struth and their 2 sons. Members of the Isaac Walton League heard a proposal from former Orinoco Mayor Julius J. Reeder for construction of a new Lake Shady Dam. Mr. Reeder told the gathering at Kings Park that you all know what Lake Shady and its beautiful park were in the past. There was no more beautiful camping and picnicking grounds to be found anywhere in Minnesota. The mill rights and property may be purchased for $22,000, and the dam, which can be used to generate electricity, could be built for $30,000. Back copies of the Rochester newspapers can be found at the History Center of Olmsted County, celebrating 100 years throughout 2026. Join us again in July to learn of expansion of the St. Mary's Hospital nursing program.